Are you allowed to get like C's and D's in a master's as long as you get like the goal is all A's, but
All right, so I got some stuff we need to talk about. By the way, welcome back. To those of you I didn't say welcome back to yesterday. Those of you I did say welcome back. Well, I guess welcome back again. Back we're going to our final 8 weeks here. I want to talk a little bit about schedule. I have a revision I'd like to make, but before I talk about that, with respect to the healthcare presentation cases, we do have our cases identified. I apologize for those of you who took DaVita. I just thought it was too funny, but that you picked one that our presenter, our audience is going to be very well versed on. But I make a joke about how much scrutiny is going to be under. It's not going to be that bad, but you will need to know your stuff. To facilitate that, we are going to have weekly deliverables. They are going to be informal, but I do expect you to complete them. So for next week, for the organizations that you have selected, I would like somebody in the group to be able to speak articulately about the history of the organization, a little bit about what their industry is. You do not need to go into detail about the fraud just yet. I just want to know about the organization. So somebody make a note of that. That's going to be what we're going to talk about at the beginning of class next week. Want to know what is it going on with your company, and what is their business model, and what is their history. That's kind of the goal. Let's talk about the fraud cases that you all are putting together. So those are supposed to be due at the end of week 10. And I was thinking about that this morning, and I realized that doesn't really make any sense anymore, because the original goal of this was to actually have the fraud case take place after we'd finished all of our investigations. But as everybody knows, they changed the timeline for the investigations to 4 weeks from 3 weeks. And so we're going to be completing our investigations on week 12. So what I think I'd like to do is I'd like to push back the deliverable for the second deliverable to week 12. Now, this does not mean that you can't complete it by week 10. I don't want anybody to think, okay, well, that's going to make week 12 much more difficult. If you had planned on delivering it week 10, that's absolutely fine. Okay, you can still do so, but it's going to give a little bit extra time. I also am aware that there's like big things going on in between now and week 12, like next week is the last week of HIDA, which might affect a few people in the class. And then graduate comps is week 11. So that's kind of why I strategically spoke week 12. I do not know what other instructors have scheduled for week 12. If it somehow falls on a week that week and that you've got a lot going on, I apologize for that, which is why I'm telling you, make sure that you plan your schedule accordingly and get the work done that you need to be done. If you need to do it in week 10, just do that. But this will give you a little bit of extra time. This will limit the number of weeks that we'll have for the investigation. So basically, I guess I should probably bring this up. So this is going to be going to Thursday, April 9th. I'm still going to set the deliverable three for April 23rd, which is the results of the investigation. That gives you 2 weeks to investigate and do your write-up. I know that's a shorter time than you used to, but these should be much more straightforward investigations that you're going to be dealing one-on-one with individuals. So the communication line should be more well established. And you shouldn't have too much issue with the scope of the investigation, considering it's going to be dramatically scaled back for the one-on-one investigations. So that's going to be, I think that's going to be the plan for that, if there's any suggestions on that. And then our presentations will take place on the Thursday of week 15, and then during finals week. Just as a reminder, if you're worried about the time to actually do your presentation preparation, week 15 on Tuesday, we are not officially meeting as a class. I gave you that day to work on your presentations. So you're going to have a little bit of extra time to work on that informally. I can't enforce that. If you decide to watch Netflix instead of that, then that's your choice. You just have to work on it at some other point. But that was the intention of that. All right. I think that's all I wanted to talk about. So let's get talking about fraud prevention and deterrence. So we're going to be talking about the COSO Fraud Risk Management Guide, which bears similarities to something else that we've talked about. At least most of you and I have talked about in many other classes. And be like, Dr. Barnes, you mentioned this in every class. And it's true, I do. I talk about it in every single class, which is why I expect you all to be experts on the COSO Internal Control Integrated Framework. And if you're not experts on that, that's fine, but we're going to get up to speed very, very quickly. So the first question is, what are the 5 components of the COSO Internal Control Integrated Framework, which was a pretty easy web search, but I'm pretty sure that many of you could have recited that in your sleep by now. I know I definitely can. So Hannah, I'm looking at you right now, and I want you to look me in the eye. I don't want you to look down at your computer. I want you to tell me, What are the 5 components and what do they represent?
Control environment, risk assessment, what do you want? Control environment is shown at the top. Risk assessment is identifying key risk areas. Control activities is creating controls for prevention and
Good.
protection.
Hey, right here, right here.
Communication is getting the information and then communicating it.
Okay.
And monitoring is checking in on it over and again.
Yeah, really well done. Okay, round of applause for Hannah on that one. That was really well done. I did not tell Hannah I was going to do that beforehand, so the pressure was definitely on. Okay, those of you who are tax track, I didn't select you for that one because I did select the audit track because they know how I feel about the COSO internal control integrated framework. But that was really well done, really well done. So yeah, 5 components that we've talked about before that kind of comprise what we think about with the nature of internal controls. Just an expansion on that. Which one have I said is probably the most important of these? Historically, I've said it in like 5 different courses with you guys. Control environment. Yeah, the tone at the top. If people don't take controls seriously, then an organization will not have good controls. Now, that's relevant because we're going to be talking about it with respect to fraud risk management, and it's actually relevant to one of the questions. Okay. So moving on to the easier questions. I gave Hannah a really, really difficult one on this one, so I'm probably going to lay off on the rest of the questions. But depending on which resource you refer to, a fraud risk assessment will generally follow 5 to 7 steps, which the resource I specifically had you look at, the audit board blog piece, had 7 steps. What are the steps in a fraud risk assessment, and briefly describe what is involved in each step? Okay, so let's go through these one at a time. There was some detailed information. What I'm going to ask you to do is when you identify the step, please just give me not a verbatim recitation, but kind of summarize what you and your group found. Because I know that if we go into that, you could say, okay, the first step is this, and you recite it verbatim and give me all the bullet points and all that. I want you to just kind of give me some general guidelines. If nothing else, you can just restate the step itself in other terms. You can just say identify risks is identify risks, okay? Which I've kind of given away the first step. Yeah, identification of risk is risk identification. There we go. All right. So step number 2, Alex, what do we got?
I said quantifying risk, which would be assessing the likelihood or occurrence of identified risks and the significance to the organization.
Good. So quantifying risks, so likelihood and the likelihood of something taking place is probably really, really important because we do need to think about that from the context of something else a little bit later on. Good. Yeah. So likelihood, I think significance also was included in that. What is step number 3, Brett?
On risk, developing strategies to address the risk of choosing to avoid, transfer, or negate, etc.
Good. All right. Step number 4, Kate.
Monitor and review risks,
Okay. And what is that?
continuously evaluating the risks and their responses.
Okay, good. So making sure we evaluate what's going on and we update as necessary. Step number 5, I think I said 7. This is only 5 that I've got here. Did I get that wrong? Or no, it's only 7 somewhere else. Okay, it's 5 here. So 5 here, which is probably really important because there's a reason that's 5, only 5. So what's number 5, Meg?
Report risk, you could communicate findings to the entire company to create widespread knowledge.
Okay, good. So communication of information across the organization. Now, these sound very, very familiar, and there's a reason for that. As I like to say in all of my classes, and this is true, those of you who have taken advanced AS would know that I like to do this. I like to compare everything to the COSO internal control integrated framework. So let's go ahead and do that. We're going to talk a little bit about that. Before we do that, something that's going to be very relevant to your assignment on Thursday are going to be the 5 fraud risk management principles. And I did look at some of the companies. A lot of people really like The Office, by the way, is the one thing I can tell you. So the case that you do on Thursday, a lot of people who do that did that particular organization, some very good identification there. But before we answer that question, we need to know what the 5 fraud risk management principles are. So let's go ahead and get into a little bit of detail there. I don't want to really define these in depth because we're going to talk about these at a more higher level. But let's just go ahead and list these off. I think it's Tyler M. I wrote down Tyler, and are you the group leader, Tyler?
Yeah.
Okay, so what are the 5 fraud risk management principles?
Fraud risk governance, fraud risk assessment, fraud control activities, fraud investigation, corrective action, fraud risk management, monitoring.
Yes, okay. So fraud risk government, fraud risk assessment, fraud control activity, fraud investigation and corrective action, and fraud risk management and monitoring activities. boy, this sounds also really familiar. This sounds just like the COSO framework. It's like they took the COSO framework and stamped fraud at the very beginning of every term. That's not exactly true. Okay, there are some differentiations there, but for some of these, we can actually look and see it is true. Fraud, it's a risk assessment. Now we have fraud risk assessment. Control activity, we have fraud control activity, and monitoring activities, fraud risk management monitoring activities. So they did a little bit of diversification there. Now, the difference there, obviously, is we're going to be saying, we're going to be talking about how do these align with internal control integrated framework? They're effectively the same, albeit specific to fraud. Now, I'm going to be honest. This is a little bit of a letdown. If I were to create a framework of my own, I don't know that I would take COSO and I would just recite it verbatim and then just stamp fraud at the beginning. I would try to be a little bit more original, but it does convey the point, is that the control framework that we already know and love and familiar with, this is something that can be adapted to consideration specifically of fraud. Now, hold on to that because we're going to be going into a little bit more depth. All right, but now question number 4 says, presumably identified an extremely strong correlation between the components in question 1 and the principles in question 3. That being the case, why do you think it's necessary for COSO to issue separate fraud risk management guidelines rather than just refer to the components of internal control? So this first question, really an important one. Since I went really hard on Hannah on the first question, I'm going to skip over Hannah on this one and go to Alex again. So what did your group identify on this one?
We said that these were issued separately because internal controls focus more on general risk and financial reporting, where fraud risk management involves identifying intentional action to get around these controls.
Yes, that's an important word, intentional actions. What do we know about misstatements? What do we know about misstatements? There's 2 categories of misstatements. There's intentional misstatements, which is the subject of this course, fraud, and there's unintentional misstatements. How would we classify an unintentional misstatement? A mistake, okay, an error, all right? Now, controls as a general concept are supposed to be able to address all types of misstatements, all types of issues that take place, whether they be intentional or unintentional in nature. When we talk about fraud, we're focused specifically on intentional categorization, intentional action. So that is why we have the differentiation there. They are very, very closely related, but the fraud risk management principles are a subset of the COSO components, are a subset. That's how we can think of them. They're focused exclusively on those intentional ideas that we talked about before. All right, so yeah, and that kind of answers the question, are there aspects of fraud risk management that may not be addressed by controls? So that kind of is a flip side. Is there something that we did not pick up just categorized generally by the COSO framework that we need to have more specific guidelines on? So this is kind of the flip side. There's a little bit of the answer that we talked about, but there's also saying COSO captures everything at a very general level. Are there more specific considerations that we need to consider with respect to a fraud risk management framework? Okay, so what does your group say on this particular question, Brett? So the second question, are there aspects of fraud risk management that may not be addressed by controls?
We said accordingly, COSA and ACCT initiated an update process that included reaching out to a broad range of users, recommendations on where the fraud risk management guide can be improved, and assembled a team to take a refresh look at the guide and assess how and where it should be.
Okay, so that's a general terminology saying, look, we're going to look at what we've got right now. We need to improve it. Why do we need to improve it? Isn't COSO perfect already? Be careful how you answer that question. Isn't the COSO internal integrated framework perfect already? So I have said, this is actually a verbatim quote, controls are quite possibly the greatest thing ever. All right. But what do we know about controls? Are controls foolproof? No. So harkening back to auditing, which this is a very audit themed discussion today. So, but this is something I've talked about. So those of you who've taken auditing with me, I expect you to know this. Are there inherent limitations to internal controls? What's an example of an inherent limitation of internal controls? Management override when management. So what was my example? You go to Taco Bell and you pay for something and they don't give you your change back and you're like, oh, I need my change. It's like, well, I'm sorry, I can't open the register unless there's a transaction. That's a control. And you're going to be like, oh, okay, well, I guess I can't get my change then. That $15 that I'm owed, yeah, it just stays in the register, right? That's exactly what we do, right? No, management override would say, go get management, have them unlock that drawer. That's an override of control. Can we agree that's a necessary override of control? Yeah, it's something that occurs and it's going to something that we can't stop by controls, but it's necessary. There were two others. Remember, errors or mistakes are not necessarily going to be captured by controls. There was also that other one, which is deliberate. What was that one called? Collusion. It's when people work together to bypass controls. All right. Now, we know that the COSO framework will not be effective in addressing these concepts. We know that it cannot stop any of these limitations. Is it sufficient for us to say that a fraud risk management guideline would also not be effective in this regard? Yeah, so that would be if we just copy and pasted the COSO framework, then we'd say, yeah, these are going to be limitations of our fraud risk management principles. How satisfying is that to you as a stakeholder saying, yeah, we can't stop fraud if it's collusion? It's like, what am I paying you for then? So I think that was kind of the concept when we talked about why we need separate fraud risk management principles. Because there are some things that controls cannot stop, that a good controls framework cannot stop by the very nature of controls. So we need to have other ways of prevention and deterrence that can actually address these particular concepts. So we need to be able to stop collusion. We need to be able to stop fraudulent management override. We need to be able to capture mistakes and errors, although those are going to be less prevalent because those are not intentional areas. So I'd say the other two are going to be the most problematic. All right, question number 5. According to the audit board blog piece, what are the key areas that a fraud risk assessment should address? So there were 4 key areas that we need to talk about, but these are going to be, again, relevant to what you are going to be talking about for your assignment on Thursday. Kate, what did your group identify for these 4 areas?
Asset misappropriation, financial and non-financial reporting, regulatory compliance areas, and legal acts.
Yes. Okay. So which of these have we heard before? Heard all of these before, Dr. Barnes. We speak English. So no, which of these have we heard specifically in this course before? Asset misappropriation, that's a category of fraud that we're very familiar with. Why do we have the listing of all the others? These are just kind of subsets of things that we're already familiar with. So financial and non-financial reporting, those are going to be kind of the fraudulent financial reporting aspects. Regulatory compliance areas, that's going to be more bribery and corruption related, and then illicit acts is just more of a general terminology. So it's still the same thing that we've talked about in this course, but there are going to be kind of a different categorization. So this one's a little bit more of a challenging question that I've got to put you up with on this one. Okay, so explain the difference between the types of frauds that takes place in this areas. Does the nature of the fraud change the importance of a particular step in the fraud risk assessment process? Okay, so a little bit of kind of a combination of these two. How would we answer this particular question? And Meg, this is a more difficult, challenging question, so I'm going to go easy on you like I went easy on Hannah. So
Asset misappropriation, we said that the theft of the assets can essentially be carried out by anyone, while like reporting fraud is done by upper level authorities because they have to like bypass internal controls. And then we said does the nature of the fraud change the importance? We said no, all steps are important no matter what, and the nature of the fraud is not. Yeah,
excellent answer. Okay, so depending on what it is they're talking about fraud risk assessment, it's going to change who our focus is on. And as Meg pointed out, if we're talking about asset misappropriation, we're talking about just general stakeholders in the organization because anybody can steal, anybody can take assets. But if we're talking about financial and non-financial information, we're talking about fraudulent financial reporting, that is going to be something that's carried out almost exclusively by management, which is going to shift our focus. Now, if that's the case, let's say that I am hired to do a fraud risk assessment, specifically of fraudulent financial reporting. Can I ignore all the other steps or all the other concerns in this area? Can I ignore asset misappropriation as a risk to the organization? Could I? Yes. Okay. That's probably like you can do anything you want, Dr. Barnes. You're a rational human being. I question that second part, but you can do anything you want. Yes. But should I guess is the question. Should I ignore the aspect of asset misappropriation if I'm focused on fraudulent financial reporting? Probably not, because something we learned a long time ago is that frauds do not exist necessarily in a vacuum. Remember, we were looking early on, we were looking at the different types of frauds, and I said, hey, look at this. These numbers don't add up to 100%. They actually add up to more than 100%. What was our conclusion when we looked at those numbers? Because we were looking at the 3 different categories of fraud. We said asset misappropriation was like 80 or sorry, like 90% of the cases. Then fraudulent financial reporting was like 15%, and corruption and bribery was like 20%, which was like 135%. And we were like, okay, that doesn't make any sense. What was the reasoning behind the greater than 100%? Because we give our over 100% in this class. We do go way beyond and beyond. That's that goal. No, there were frauds that took place that involved more than one fraud scheme. Okay, so if we're talking about a fraudulent financial reporting case, there may be aspects of asset misappropriation that are also underlying. So yeah, we're talking about a particular company in auditing on Wednesday. What's the name of that company we're talking about on Wednesday? The Big E. Enron. Okay, what was going on at Big Enron? Was that a fraudulent financial reporting case, or was that an asset misappropriation case? Yes, that's the answer. It was both. Okay, both schemes existed right there, so we can't actually just look at one and leave absent the other. That's kind of the idea of particular steps in the fraud risk assessment process, is that we have to think about all different possibilities, even if we don't think that they're necessarily relevant to what we were originally slated on to look at. All right. Question number 6. According to the audit board blog piece, what are the 7 main fraud risk components? I knew there was something with 7 steps in here. So yeah. So let's go ahead and go through those. Kate, I have confidence in you that you can give me all 7. Okay. So what are those?
Assessment, prevention, detection, investigation, corrective action, and monitoring and reporting.
Okay. So let's take a look. Got a different list, but I'm not saying you're wrong. It's entirely possible that I'm wrong. So according to the audit board blog piece, fraud risk assessment components. Is this one the other groups had, or did you identify the consistent ones with Kate? This one right here? Okay, that was the one I was angling for, but you weren't that far off. I was looking at them. The wording was just a little bit weird. So what do you got? Description of fraud risk, likelihood of occurrence, significance, organization, and identification of anti-fraud controls, assessment of control effectiveness, fraud risk response, and responsible person. So all of these are going to be fraud risk components. So when we talk about how we assess fraud risk, these are each of the individual components we look at. Now, it's not important to memorize all these. I'm going to tell you right off the bat that I'm not going to ask you, all right, here's the definition, which of these is the fraud risk component. What I may ask you is, what is the relevance of these fraud risk components? Okay. So first of all, it's important to note that several of these fraud risk these components relate specifically to the steps in a fraud risk assessment. Now, I made that statement. I said these relate specifically to the steps in a fraud risk assessment. What would be an example of this? Okay, going back to something Alex said, okay, he talked about quantification of risks. Which of these items up here that are listed up here would relate to quantification of risks? Likelihood and significance. Those are both given in the definition for quantification of risk. So looking at that fraud risk steps in the fraud risk assessment, these are incorporated in there. We can actually identify points within the steps of the fraud risk assessment that are included within these items, within these components. What happens if they're not specified in the fraud risk steps themselves? So what if we look at this list? Okay, we look at this list and we look and say, okay, how do these relate to the fraud risk steps in fraud risk assessment? And we can't identify one that these cleanly fall under. Does that mean that these components are not relevant? So if I look at something like responsible person, okay, responsible person, for example, and I can't identify that this falls cleanly under one of the categories of fraud risk assessment, should I just ignore who the responsible party is for fraud risk? What does that tell us more generally? This is more of an overarching concern with respect to fraud risk assessment. This is something we have to know with fraud risk assessment, even if it's not explicitly conveyed with that. So the components either tell us something very, very specific about the fraud risk assessment steps, or they tell us these are components that are critical to the overall concern of fraud risk. Like, would we say who the responsible party is in a particular area of fraud that might concur might be very relevant with response to respect to fraud? I guess a better way of asking that is, when you do your investigation, is it important to identify who's responsible for that area of the investigation? It's like going and talking to Ben Hill and saying, Ben, can you tell me about concessions? He's like, well, I don't run concessions, so no, I can't tell you about that. Now we know that anybody named Ben H is still going to be responsible for the fraud in the organization, but it's been a week. I haven't had a chance to make any of the jokes, man. I'm sorry. Okay. All right. Anyway, So we do need to identify the responsible parties with respect to that. So this is more of an overarching concern than an explicit statements that we note about. All right, last question. So one conclusion that managers may reach is that fraud risk management assessment steps that we've just discussed are redundant due to the similarities with control evaluation. So working off of the response that we talked about question 4, and we already went into depth, but I want to see what you all came up with. Explain how you promote the fraud risk management assessment as a separate and valuable process. So what I'm asking you here is that we know that controls are important. We know that the implementation of controls in an organization are correct. And if you recall from other courses that we've talked about this, we've talked about that organizations tend to skimp on controls because they don't see the benefit relative to the costs. So let's say that you've gone through all of the efforts to make sure that your organization has good working controls. They've got a good controls framework in place. They've got a great control environment. They've got good actively designed controls and they're being followed properly. All right. So you've won half of the battle. You've won half the battle. You've convinced the management team to incur those costs because you think that they'll have a relevant benefit. Now you go in and say, all right, we've got good controls. Now we need to address fraud. And the management team says, don't our controls already address fraud? And you're going to say no. It says, what was the purpose of controls in the first place then? How do you answer that problem? How do you answer that particular argument? All right. So, Meg, what do you think?
We said that basically it's just like a more detailed outline of ways to manage fraud risk, like what we talked about earlier. Kind of addressing management override controls and like collusion.
Good references. Tyler, you got anything to add to that?
He said they're like a checklist, simple design, they have a purpose.
Sure. And so the whole goal here is to actually think specifically about fraud. Now, going back to what we know from the COSO control environment, this is something I talked about. The control environment I said was the most important step. This is something that's stuck with us through all the courses we've had together. So the control environment is most important. Why is the control environment the most important? Because if people don't take controls at the top, don't take controls seriously, then no one else in the organization will. I say, Dr. Barnes, can I cheat on the quiz? No, you absolutely may not cheat on the quiz. What does that signal does that send to you? Well, he's very serious about this. Dr. Barnes, can you cheat on the quiz? I don't care. Do what you want. Okay. Yeah. So that's going to be the case there. Now, can we say that same mindset holds for fraud in an organization? Didn't I just use fraud as an example? Isn't cheating a form of fraud? Yeah, if we don't take fraud seriously in an organization, then the same problems will occur. So that same fraud risk mindset has to exist if we're going to actually answer problems. The difference being is that it's a different series of problems. They are related, but not exactly the same. As Meg pointed out, we actually talked about 2 specific examples, misappropriation, management override and collusion. Those are things that we need to be able to address with respect to our fraud risk management concerns. So the answer to this question is this is an additional cost, but it's a really important one to consider because controls are not going to be not going to answer every single problem. I hate saying that because you all know controls are my favorite thing in the world, but controls are not going to be effective in many regards, and we need to have additional steps in place to be able to address the gaps that exist with respect to that. And one of fraud risk management, fraud risk assessments are going to help us in that regard. All right. Well, I've stumbled through that enough, so I think we're going to call it good here. I think we have Madoff on Thursday. No, we have Choose Your Own Case on Thursday. We just talked about that, so I'll see you all then.
Thursday.